The second variant of the way of liberation and justice is Christianity. There continues to be considerable debate regarding the position of Jesus within the political theological spectrum of first-century Palestinian Judaism. One school understands him as essentially a radicalized Hillel school Pharisee. The Jesus we encounter in the Synoptic Gospels was clearly a teacher of the oral Torah, reinterpreting the Hebrew Scriptures in a manner more in line with the social setting in which he found himself. This is fundamentally what it meant to be a Pharisee. Second, like the school of Hillel, he emphasized the moral law rather than ritual purity, as did the school of Shammai. Third, the general pattern of his ministry, with its emphasis on teaching and healing, is characteristic for the rabbinic pattern of the period. Finally, he seems to have participated in Pharisaic-type fellowship meals, of which the Last Supper is an example. The content of Jesus' teaching also shows significant Pharisaic influence. This is evident in any number of places. Jesus' answers to the questions posed to him while teaching in the temple, and particularly the question concerning the Great Commandment, put him more or less squarely in the Pharisaic camp, marked as it was by a focus of love on God and neighbor as the central aspect of Jewish life, a belief in the resurrection, and internal divisions regarding such questions as the lawfulness of paying tribute to Caesar. The prayer which Jesus taught his disciples, elements of which are preserved in the Lord's Prayer, also contains several Pharisaic elements, such as a sense of intimacy with God, who is addressed as Father, a desire for the coming kingdom, and a focus on the accomplishment of God's will on earth. Recent scholarship has, however, increasingly questioned this consensus, arguing that Jesus was the leader of one of the last revolutionary messianic uprisings, and perhaps even the catalyst for the Jewish war. This thesis depends on a more skeptical reading of the Synoptics, regarding them as not merely attempting to differentiate emerging Christianity from the Pharisaic Judaism out of which it emerged, but as actually falsifying events to hide the dangerous memory of one who understood himself as the Davidic Messiah. We cannot engage in this context all of the evidence brought to bear by scholars like Eisenman and Tabor. Suffice it to say that even the Synoptics also provide support for this image of Jesus, the high note of eschatological expectation which characterizes what even the most critical scholars acknowledge as authentic sayings, such as Mark 4, the march on and the messianic entry into Jerusalem, and the fact that Jesus was, in the end, executed by the Romans as a Jewish royal pretender. Regardless of which of these two pictures turns out to be more accurate, and it is entirely possible that neither is, and that we will never really know the historic Jesus, already at the level of the canon of the New Testament, Christianity represents a distinct departure from the Jewish variant of the way of justice and liberation, in both its emergent rabbinic and its messianic forms. On the one hand, whatever the extent to which the historical Jesus was involved in messianic movements, Christianity embraces him as Moshiach. On the other hand, it embraces this messianism precisely in its failure, thus requiring a radical reinterpretation of the messianic event. Thus the synoptic infancy narratives, the many differences between them notwithstanding, all place the birth of Jesus at the time of a defeated insurrection. Just what Christians do with this defeat depends on the way they handle the engagement between the originally Jewish encounter with the sacred in the struggle for justice and the Hellenic, Latin, Celtic, and Germanic ways with which Judaism became syncretized. There's been a good deal of ink spilled in debate around the social composition of the early Christian communities. Some, such as Kautsky and Weber, claim that Christianity found its constituency among the exploited and lower middle strata. Others, such as Demetrius Kirtatis, have suggested that Christianity, at least outside of Israel, was primarily a movement of the wealthy. Recent scholarship has begun to bring some closure to this debate by pointing out the internal diversity of the early Christian communities and focusing attention on the political valence of Christianity with the context of the social world of the Hellenistic cities to which it spread. Specifically, Tyson shows that the early Christian communities included a broad range of the middle strata of Hellenistic and Roman society, ranging from a small number of equestrians occupying senior military and civilian positions in the colonial administration, and a much larger group of decurions who had the unenviable responsibility for collecting taxes owed to Rome, or making up the difference from their own resources, through a middle stratum of merchants, artisans, some of whom were very wealthy and others of whom were poor, to an urban plebeianate of wage workers and the marginally employed, as well as slaves, some of whom might have been rather well off and secure, and others of whom may have been severely exploited, but whose conditions were better than those employed in agriculture or the mines. Within this context, the story of Jesus began to take on a very different significance. The larger framework for this reinterpretation was given by the principal form of popular religion in the Mediterranean basin, the mystery cults, which we discussed last week. These cults promised eternal life to anyone who went through a process of catechesis and initiation, leading up to the revelation of the central mystery and a communion meal. The story of Jesus, as it was handed down by his followers, fit well in this framework. He looked like another dying and rising God, and there was no reason why a format which had adopted Egyptian and Persian stories as well as Greek could not accommodate one from Israel, whose religion had acquired a certain mystique because of its focus on rationality and ethical conduct. The syncretism with Greek culture was extended at the level of the high tradition by a syncretism with Greek philosophy, which contributed to Christianity many of its principal concepts. Specifically, Christianity used ideas drawn from Greek philosophy to theorize just how it might be possible for humanity to overcome its finitude and contingency and achieve theosis, or deification. These changes are, above all, concentrated on the doctrines of the Trinity and the Incarnation. Christianity needed a language in which it could speak of God as one in essence, but of three persons, and of Jesus as at once truly God and truly human. The Platonic language of ousia, essence or nature, and hypostasis, or person, provided a way to do this. Christian Platonism was, first and foremost, a theorization of the Holy Trinity and of the person of Jesus in terms of the successions of hypostases which emanate from the Neoplatonic one. By thinking God as Trinity rather than as the One, while maintaining the underlying unity of the divine essence, Christianity began to think this essence in a new way, as something in which persons could participate in varying degrees. The divine persons of the Holy Trinity participate in it by nature. They are it. Others share in it as a superadded quality, as food becomes hot when cooked, without itself becoming heat. By thinking of Jesus as one unified person who is both human and divine, Christianity opened the road for human beings to take on the divine nature. Working out the details of this was beyond the Neoplatonists, who would have to await the subtlety of the medieval Aristotelians, and of Thomas Aquinas in particular, who applied to it the categories of substance and accident, potency and act. But the beginning of the process was here, and it was enough to provide an ontological foundation for the perfect mystery cult, one which conferred not just immortality, which is how the Greeks had understood divinity, but divinity proper as it was understood by this peculiar synthesis of dialectics and prophetic religion, which was gradually replacing the Hellenic ideal. Only such a mystery cult could provide the ideal for an entire civilization. In the context of the Orthodox tradition, which became dominant in the Greek world and also in the Slavic societies as they adopted the Christian tradition, theosis was understood as taking place first and foremost by way of participation in the divine liturgy. The beauty of the liturgy forms the senses in a way which orders the whole person towards God, while the sacraments infuse supernatural capacities which transcend the merely human and allow human beings to begin to participate, little by little, in the divine nature. As Christianity spread through Western Europe, it encountered a variety of other cultures and traditions. From Rome, Christianity took its institutional structure and a legal tradition, so that it functioned throughout the West as a kind of quasi-state with broad responsibility not only for the spiritual development of the people, but also for ensuring that secular rulers acted in accord with natural law and in service to the common good. Christianity was appropriated in the Celtic regions in a way that reflected the historic Celtic emphasis on learning and on intellectual and moral virtue as the condition for leadership. Institutionally, it meant a Christianity centered on monasteries, where people went to pursue wisdom and to live in a just community. Ideologically, it meant a Christianity which, in addition to various Celtic elements, fused Jewish Christianity with Neoplatonism. Indeed, in the Celtic regions we find a greater emphasis on Jewish Christian traditions than on any other part of Christendom. For Germanic peoples, Jesus appeared as a kind of victorious warrior who had vanquished Satan, much as Beowulf vanquished Grendel, and who shared the spoils of his victory, forgiveness of sins, and eternal life with his faithful followers. These various trends flowed together in the Catholic synthesis represented above all in the work of Thomas Aquinas and Dante Alighieri, for whom the end of human life is indeed theosis, but for whom theosis consists above all in caritative wisdom, in loving God and our neighbor with God's own love, a capacity which is created in us through faith and through participation in the sacraments, but which we must actively cultivate through ethical conduct, the struggle for justice, and spiritual discipline. It is above all this capacity for syncretism which has made the Catholic tradition so enduring and so powerful. Witness its ability, even as Europe was conquering the Americas, to absorb enough of the indigenous traditions that the indigenous people were able to see themselves as part of the story that the Church told, a story they retold themselves as the protagonists in a struggle for ongoing liberation and justice. Tonantzin, the Totonac mother goddess, becomes identified with Mary and becomes a symbol for the Mexican Revolution in the form of Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe. Not everyone, to be sure, supported this synthesis. It was especially troubling to the emerging absolute monarchies and the emerging bourgeoisie, who did not want to be held accountable for the justice of their actions by the Pope or the local bishops. And of course the Church, itself far from perfect, was vulnerable to attacks from reformers. We will consider the impact of these dynamics next week when we look at the Reformation.